funding of education has now become a personal requirement as opposed to a public requirement. So 25 years ago, the state funded 75% of the education of the student, and the student and their family funded 25%. That is now inverted. The state's funding less than 25% of the education, and the student and their family are funding the rest of it. And the cost per year of education has not changed. Inflation adjusted, it's within $100 of what it was 15 years ago. So despite new technologies and everything else, we've actually been able to manage the cost of that inflation adjusted pretty well. It's just who's paying it is what's changed. And as a consequence, that really has pushed, you know, our in-state tuition is one of the highest in the Big 12. And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for our students, and it's not sustainable for society. And we are reaching that point where we are going to be out of the reach, we're not going to be accessible to a significant segment of our society if we don't figure out how to get this under control. So that's certainly one of our biggest challenges that I see going forward, is trying to work with our states to understand the value proposition and what they risk by not investing in higher education. If they don't invest in higher education, they're not going to have a workforce. They don't have a workforce, they're not going to have companies. You don't have companies, you don't have an economy. It's pretty much that simple, but they don't really think about it like that. So trying to help them understand that is really the tack that we've taken on. Certainly what we've seen in funding for higher education has been through funding for research as well in America. You know, we went through a period of expansion of funding, particularly at the NIH under Clinton and Bush, but it's been on a steady decline ever since. We got about a $2 billion bump in the current budget, but we're below 2002 funding levels for research in America. And when you think about what that means, is if only one out of, it used to be 1 out of every 3 grants got funded, now it's about one out, depending on the agency, somewhere between 1 out of, between 9% and 15% of grants being funded right now. And you think that pressure that it puts on our research enterprise, on our researchers, on our research faculty, on our graduate students, and I don't know, you know, frankly, why if a student went in and they saw that that's environment, why they would be very interested in pursuing that path, at least into the academic side, because it is such a challenge to get funded in this current environment. And with constraining resources, it's just getting more competitive. So that certainly will continue to be a challenge for us. And again, with a fixed number of dollars, at least on the federal side, you only grow by moving it from somebody else, by moving that market share of research dollars. Which we've made some progress in the last couple of years. We've also gotten a lot more creative about who we do research with. We have about $80 million a year right now in the School of Education, but that's mostly working with school districts and states. That's not the federal government. And so thinking very creatively about that is going to be certainly important. And then thinking about how education itself is actually evolving. With the pace of technology change right now, which is exponential, it's projected that a current college graduate is going to have to change their careers 7 times over the course of their lifetime. Not jobs, careers. And they're going to be doing jobs we haven't even thought of yet, because it's just changing that quickly. So how do you prepare somebody for that? What skill set do we need to be providing for our students to be able to succeed in that environment when it's changing that fast? I mean, the actual content of what we're giving them is probably going to be obsolete in 10 years. So it's really not the content that's going to be important. It's how you evaluate the content. It's the skill set that you have, the critical thinking, the ability to adapt to new technologies. And then as a university, I think it's our obligation to help provide the platforms for them to continue to do that, not just up until they graduate, but well beyond that, as they go throughout their careers, being able to, or figuring out how to make that available to them once they leave our campus and go out to continue to be successful. And so that creates really a different dynamic. And we know the type of education has changed. You know, the traditional stand in front of the classroom and give a lecture to a couple hundred students is rapidly going away. And we know that model only has about a 10% effectiveness rate in terms of somebody's ability to retain what you hear in a 1 hour or 50-minute lecture. So flipping the classroom is the term that you'll hear. You're probably familiar with it, but that's really delivering the content in some other method, either online or through readings ahead of class time, but then spending your class time actually problem solving, taking those principles and applying it to whatever the problem is, and doing that within the classroom itself. And that requires different spaces like this, where we could talk about that content, we could talk about a problem, and then you break down and you guys work over here, and you work over there, and you work over there, and you come up with some solutions, and then you come back up and you talk about it, and you think about some other problems, and you go back down again. And doing that within that classroom time is a much more effective teaching methodology. But it requires, us as teachers to learn how to do something very different, and that's not so easy. But it also requires different kinds of spaces. And so a lot of what you've seen in recent building incorporates much more flexible space and very few lecture halls, if you will, because that's just becoming an outmoded way of delivering a lot of the content that we work with our students. Obviously, we're going through a challenging budget time right now. There's lots of reasons for that, but the reality of it is we have found ourselves at a point of expending annually significantly more money than we bring in annually. And I think none of us in our own household budgets could sustain that for very long, and only the federal government can do that. They just print more money, but we don't have the ability to do that. And so we are going through a correction right now to get us to at least in line to match our spending to our income. But at the same time, going through and trying to figure out new models that will, budget models that will allow money to support, for example, where we have growth opportunities. And just as an example, I'll talk about the business school one because that's the fastest growing one right now. I think it grew 13% this year. That takes resources to support that growth in students, and whatever our model is has to be able to provide them the resources if they're going to grow that fast. That also means it's going to squeeze somewhere else if they happen to be shrinking. And so working through that is not easy work, but it's important work because that's what's going to set us up for success going forward. And then working aggressively in Topeka to restore some of that base funding to help us toe the line on tuition, to help us get into the ability to give raises to our people, which we've maybe done one in 10 years. That is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for our staff, and it's not sustainable for our faculty. We've got to be able to get to a position where we can support them with competitive pay, or else we're going to continue to lose good people. And so I'm happy to report that we just finished the Regents meeting last week, consolidated the plan. The ask for all of higher education is a consolidated one. KU doesn't have a specific ask there, K-State doesn't. We're all carrying the same message, just restore our base funding back to where we were in 2008. And then put an inflator on it and give us some stability there. We'll see how successful we are in that. It's going to be a challenging budget cycle coming up. They still haven't fixed K through 12 to the court's satisfaction. And it's not clear what's going to happen in the elections coming up. So that could have a very profound effect on what happens to us in the next couple of years. So we're certainly trying to plan for that, but we think we have a path forward if we can get them to restore some of our base funding. KU right now, as a whole, all our campuses, we're down about $33 million from where we were in 2008. And if you put a CPI on that, that's $75 million a year that we are down since 2008. If you actually put a higher education price index on it, which more reflects what we spend money on, that's about $93 million per year that we are down in state funding from 2008. So, we have to somehow work with the legislature and the governor to get us back on the right track there. We can't keep shrinking like this and expect a different result. And so that's the message that we're taking. It's a unified message. It certainly resonates with some portion of the legislature. We'll see how much of it, and see if we can move the needle on that. I think that's enough depressing stuff, so I'm gonna stop there and take some questions, if that would be okay.
I was curious, you talked about the university having spending more than you get. How do you do that in your budget? I'm curious.
Well, you do that by having had some cash. I wouldn't say reserves, because it wasn't. The reserve source implies you intentionally set it aside to a rainy day fund, and it wasn't that, but it was cash that was intentionally intended for something else, but had to get repurposed to meet the base funding. And again, a number of things played into that, not the least of which was a 7% budget cut in 2016 that we did not see coming and happened at the very end of June, with no time to do anything about it in July, but we really, then in 2017 and 2018, did not build it into the budgets. And so that burned through sort of whatever cash we had out there in all its various forms pretty quickly. And so it softens the blow, but at some point you have to build it into your base budgeting. So we essentially depleted the savings account.
Right.
Yes, sir.
The question about base funding, I know the state always says it just doesn't have enough money, but how big a factor do you think the anti-science, anti-intellectual streak that runs through our Kansas legislature, how big a factor do you think that is in achieving base funding?
You know, I think there's no question that there's there was a philosophical shift about 7 years ago in the state legislature. There was also a shift in the percentage of our legislature that had a college degree. And so we had a majority that did not. And you know, so of course their perception of what higher ed is very different than somebody who's experienced it and experienced the benefits from it. And you know, and it kind of shifted towards tech and vocation, and that's what we really needed to do for people, and it is what we need to do for some people. But we need the entire spectrum. I think we would all agree, and the data does not lie. I mean, you can double your lifetime income with a college degree. It's just a true statement. And so, is it worth that investment? Absolutely. Is it worth it for the state? No question. But you're right. I mean, we dealt with a backlash for a number of years. Now, the election 2 years ago reversed that to some degree. We got a little bit more stability there, which is why we saw some course correction. So I don't know what this year's going to bring, but I think we've overcome some of that, and I think it's. And in all fairness, I'm not sure we've done the best job of helping people understand the value of the education. We all take it inherently. We're here, it's what we do for a living. We wouldn't be here without it. And we assume everybody else agrees with that, but the reality is not everybody understands that. And so it behooves us to do a better job of telling our story and helping them understand why it matters and why the economy is going to suffer regionally if we don't invest here. And it will, and it doesn't take that long, particularly in this current environment where there's tremendous pressure for talent. It's going to accelerate this process very quickly, I think.
I have another question about core curriculum. I mean, we made a fairly significant change 2 or 3 years ago. What's your read on how is that working here at KU? Well,
I think conceptually, I think it's working pretty well. I know that there are some bugs in it, and I know
right.
that it's not, I mean, you never get anything right the first time, quite honestly. And so you have to be willing to go back and revisit and refocus. But it was clear that we were challenging students to get a degree in 4 years by not being able to get the classes they needed to get
right.
to progress. And that's really not fair to the students. And so figuring out a different pathway that allows them to continue to progress and that we don't create bottlenecks for them. It's hard enough for them to progress without us doing that, but you know, we can't be responsible for that. So I think it helped there, and that's certainly been reflective, and we have the highest graduation rate we've had in history of KU. We've got the highest retention rate and progression rate in the history of the university. It's not where it should be, but it's better than it's ever been. So I think it is helping on that side. But I know in talking with the provost and others that they're going back and having to relook at sort of what counts, what doesn't count, what should count in terms of courses.
What are some of the bugs?
Well, I think, and I'm getting into territory, I'll probably get myself in trouble because I don't know enough. But I think some of them were maybe not enough courses in certain areas to meet requirements and too many in other areas to meet requirements, and that dilutes these, and these still are bottlenecked, and trying to figure that out. And then there are still a few courses, you know, if you look at the DFW rate for courses, that's the other thing you look at. And if it's a required course and you've got a DFW rate of 40%, meaning 40% of your students are not leaving that class, you just threw them behind at least a year.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean they should go forward, but it suggests to me that we need to think differently about that course and what we resource around that course to make sure those students continue to progress, and we provide them what they need in real time to help them move on so that they don't end up being here for 6 years to get their 4-year degree. It's just too expensive to do that, and so it behooves us to help them be as successful as we can.
I want to follow up on what he talked about, anti-intellectualism, and I apologize in advance, I'm a fourth generation shocker, so, but they had a Harvard economist recently did a study for the city, I don't know if you heard about it, but he talked about attitudes about higher education, and the majority of people in Wichita feel like it's not worth it, it's not a worthwhile investment. And I think a lot of people are disappointed now. It seems like jobs you could get before with a high school diploma and make a fairly decent lower middle income wage. Now they want a high undergraduate degree with the same entry level, yet the salary doesn't ramp up. So people feel like it's kind of like a shell game. And I just wondered what you think about that.
Well, I think there's about 9 things packed into that question.
Well, I understand.
You know, it is true that in the current and the projected future economy, that 90% of new jobs will require something after high school. Not necessarily a 4-year degree, but something after high school. It might be a certificate, it might be associate's degree, or it might be a 4-year degree or beyond. And so part of that is a change in jobs. I mean, those manufacturing jobs are disappearing that you could step into straight out of high school and have a lifetime career in manufacturing. Those jobs are going away. They're either going overseas or they're being replaced by robotics. And then your entry-level job is figuring out how to run a robot. Well, that's very different than what a high school student's going to be able to do. Doesn't mean you need a 4-year degree, but it does mean you need something. And so in that sense, you know, it is a reality that our jobs are requiring more education. I think there's also a belief that if you don't have a degree in, you know, engineering or something that's very applied, that it's not a worthwhile degree. And as one of our alums, Adam Ray, who's on his 3rd startup company, having already successfully exited 2 of them, is a very proud English major, undergraduate English major without an advanced degree. And he will tell you, and I didn't believe him, so he sent me the data, 50% of technology company CEOs have a liberal arts background. And it's because of the skills that they learn with a liberal arts background that the engineers don't get. They don't have time. They're learning so much other stuff, they don't get that broad-based education. But it's the communication, it's the marketing, it's the understanding of systems. And that really a liberal arts background brings that ultimately gets applied. It's just not as direct of a connection from point A to point B. And so that's a bit of a problem on the company side. We did focus groups across 8 different industry sectors in Kansas City saying, what are you looking for when you want somebody? You tell us our graduates don't have the right soft skills. What does that mean? Well, it really means they quit doing their training programs when they hired somebody new to train them how to function in their companies. They used to spend 2 or 3 years doing that, but that was okay because they had them for 20 years. But now they're going to have an employee for 5 to 7 years, and that return on investment for the company is not there, so they want us to do that, which actually is okay, but they have to help us do that. But it's also a question of, you say you have to have a 4-year degree in these 5 specialties. Why? What are you really looking for? And can somebody else meet that need? Because they're being forced to really broaden their horizons to figure out to get the talent that they need. And it may not be a 4-year degree. It may be a different set of criteria that they really need and that they want and can take. So I think it's a really complicated question right now. There's no question still that the return on investment is there in lifetime earning. But I think what we, again in higher ed, I don't know that we've always done the best job of showing that, of displaying that. And we haven't always done the best job of connecting our graduates to whatever it is that they want to do in the future and making those very clear pathways to do that. And I think we have opportunities to do better there. Yes, sir.
Have you had much pressure put on you to revive the Western Civilization program?
You know, there's, I do hear about that. And I hear about that really from our alums as much as anybody else, when they put it in the context of the importance of that in their own personal education and how they feel like that influenced them throughout their careers. So that is something that we hear. And, you know, the challenge is we also have to respond to what students are asking for. And that's where the challenge. You can't force people to do things, generally speaking. And so, again, I think what we have to do is a better job, as we just talked about, of showing why that's important and what value that brings, and then why we should carry it on. Yeah.
If I could speak to that for a second, my mom and dad and brother all went to KU, and my brother was 4 years older than me, and so when I started at KU, they had just stopped requiring Western civilization. When my brother took it, he hated it, and I remember him hating it so much and trying to, you know, figure out what the books were about without actually doing the entire reading, and just being so overwhelmed by the amount of books. And then it wasn't required for me, but I decided to take it anyway. And it was one of the most amazing classes. I had a really incredible professor and discussion group, and it was a really diverse discussion group. And most of the class actually did all of the readings, and it was, I really enjoyed it, but I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much if it had been forced. I just don't, I think that takes away the appeal of feeling like I decided to take this class. I feel good about deciding to read all of these books and write all of these papers. And what's up there?
I have a question, but first I have a comment on what you're saying.
Great.
When I took it and Western Civ was required, there were a lot of people teaching Western Civ. And I imagine that the best Western Civ teachers were a fraction of that group. And that a lot of us, I know I went to great lengths to change section one year because one day with my teacher, I did not want to be in that Western Civ section. And I got into another one, John Cormack, that was just amazing, really good. So a lot depended on your
It's better
teacher.
to have, only the professors that really want to be teaching that course and that are super passionate about it.
Then my teacher that first day threw out all of the materials that were actually supposed to be the core of the Western Civ program. She had written her own book, which we were going to study.
It's just whatever.
I'm sure it was the best one.
Can I ask though, could you talk
You had a
little
question too,
more
that's right.
about the influence of industry on program development at KU?